Number one, mindset. Having the correct mindset playing hardcore Diablo can be all the difference between having a fun, rewarding playthrough and having a terrible, frustrating experience. So for me, that mindset is that at some point my character is going to die. The goal is to make sure that when you do die, it's not from being unprepared, not paying attention, or relearning a lesson that you've already learned in your previous playthroughs, whether that be hardcore or softcore. Making sure you have a lot of alts ready to go, you've got gear for those other characters ready, is important while you're playing hardcore in Diablo. So during my playthrough, I'm going to make sure that anytime I'm swapping out gear, I'm going to save the things, unless I really need to break them down, that I'm just now trading out, so that if I do die, and when I do die, I can give those things to my new character that I've already got ready to go. Having this mindset is going to help you reduce panic, which is oftentimes going to be the difference between life and death when playing hardcore. Panic, when you get into a tight spot, is the number one cause for death in Diablo 4. And finally, remember to have fun while you're playing hardcore in Diablo 4 Season 1. Number 2, preparation. Before Season 1 begins, on a hardcore character, make sure that you've unlocked the horse, completed the campaign, and you've discovered all areas and found all of the altars of Lilith. That'll make sure that when you begin Season 1, you can skip the campaign, getting right into the new seasonal mechanics. You also should have enough renown to get you halfway through level 3 for all of your renown, giving you 5 skill points right when you start, as well as making your next set of 5 skill points that much easier to get during the season. Now, there's some question as to whether or not your softcore renown progress will apply to your hardcore character in Season 1. The way that the game is currently mech'd, your horse will transfer over, as well as being able to skip the campaign if you've done those things in softcore. But your renown, all of the areas, waypoints, quests, things that you've discovered in your softcore playthrough will not apply to your hardcore. So I recommend just getting all those things done on hardcore and then being ready to load that data up on the 18th of July, 2 days prior to Season 1 going live, so that you'll have all of that renown ready to go when you start Season 1 on hardcore. It's also important to note that make sure your hardcore character doesn't die before Season 1 begins, because if that's the case, all of that renown will not apply to your Season 1 playthrough. Number 3 is pacing. I find that going slow and smooth is the most survivable way to play through hardcore in Diablo, especially at the early levels, really prior to around level 50 to 70 or so. Be careful that you're not leveling up faster than your gear. Because the enemies scale to your level in Diablo 4, what can oftentimes happen is that you level very quickly, but the gear that you have on is slow to progress. You just can't find those better items, and so you can get yourself into a situation where the enemies are actually significantly more powerful than you, even though they're at the same level as you. So as you level up in Diablo 4 on hardcore, make sure you're constantly looking for new items, new pieces of gear, spending the resources where you need to get that gear leveled up as high as it can be, and make sure you're as strong as possible. As you're leveling up and trying to make sure that your gear is as good as it can possibly be in hardcore, you're probably going to find that you're going to be low on gold and low on salvage materials. What I find is that at the early levels, salvaging everything that you can find to give you as many materials as possible is more advantageous, and then selling gear later on in your playthrough to get as much money as possible to upgrade your gear can really help out. When leveling your gear, imprinting aspects from the codex can give you a pretty big boost in power and survivability. While leveling, focus on putting aspects onto your jewelry and your armor rather than your weapons, since you should be changing out your weapons relatively often to give you a good boost in power as you level up. As you start to approach level 50, the gear that you find is probably going to progress a lot slower, and at that time, it's best to start imprinting aspects on as many pieces of gear as you can, and then focus on finding sacred legendary items in Tier 3 and improving those, making sure they've got all the right aspects for your build, and going into Tier 4, getting ancestral legendaries. Number 4, know your build, but make sure you test it while you're playing. So while building your character on hardcore, prioritize defensive stats, aspects, and skills first, then offensive. As you go through your build, it's important to make sure you have multiple forms of unstoppable so you can get out of any type of CC that the enemy can apply and get out of tight situations. Unstoppable can be procced via your skills as well as some aspects that you can find in the game. A good example is the eluding aspect, which can be found in Caldera Gate and the Fractured Peaks, and gives you unstoppable anytime you are injured and take damage while CC'd. Additionally, while making your build for hardcore, look for things that can consistently apply CCs to the enemies. Anytime your enemies are crowd controlled, be that dazed, knockdown, stunned, frozen, they aren't able to do any damage to you, and you're able to get a lot more free hits in and keep your mobility up. When looking at your gear, pieces of armor like your chest and your legs can provide a significant amount of defensive stats. Right now, the way the game is mech'd, armor is probably your most important stat, followed by damage reduction. Depending on your build, you may want to prioritize damage reduction from distance or damage reduction from close. Also, while you're building your character, look through your stats and see where you can find synergies that provide damage reduction to you. For example, with the rogue, applying poison to enemies can also give you damage reduction from those enemies. As you're progressing your build, it's also important to make sure that you test it. When you're changing out items that you're unsure are a significant improvement or not, if you're changing out skill points, even if you're experimenting with your Paragon points later on in the game, go out into the world and test that build in a situation that isn't too challenging and will allow you to assess if what you've done is an improvement or not. Number 5, know your enemy. Anytime you're approaching a pack of enemies in the game, make sure you're taking a look at what the composition of those enemies are, anything that could be outside of your field of view, but are likely around those types of enemies that could be dangerous, as well as what are the elites that are within this group of enemies. And then we're going to prioritize the most important enemies first, the most dangerous enemies first. Some of the elites that can cause the biggest problems on hardcore are going to be Cold Enchanted, Fire Enchanted, and Plague Enchanted elites. Cold Enchanted elites can be the most dangerous in the game because they can consistently CC you, and if you don't have a form of Unstoppable or it's on cooldown to break out of that, the rest of the enemies will oftentimes kill you. Cold Enchanted packs of elites are especially dangerous. Fire Enchanted elites can be extremely deadly, especially when they die and they cause a large AoE explosion on the ground, as can the Plague Enchanted elites, which spread that plague to other mobs around them and also cause that explosion on death. Other enemies to focus down and prioritize are going to be ones that can kill you with a one-shot. For example, the corpse bows. Oftentimes, they like to hide in the shadows off-screen and shoot ballistas into the group that you're fighting currently, and that can be an easy one-shot for you. When I see a corpse bow in the area, I make sure to prioritize that target, get it down as quickly as I can to make sure that while I deal with the rest of the mobs, I don't end up getting killed. Boss mechanics can also be extremely important. Many bosses in the game can kill you with a one-shot, but most of the mechanics that can do that have a pretty big tell for it. For example, the Tomb Lord will cast a wall of skeleton bones in a circle around you. If you can't break out of that wall of bones in a short amount of time, that wall will explode, and the overlapping effects of those AoEs can oftentimes kill you. Finally, be looking for AoEs on the ground and around you, and if you're ever unsure that you can survive an AoE that is near you, make sure to maneuver and get out of that AoE as quickly as you can, and give those things a pretty large berth as well. There are many, many clips of hardcore players going to the graveyard, thinking that they were out of an AoE, but they just barely had a toe in it and end up dying. Which brings us to our last point, be ready to retreat. Oftentimes you'll find yourself getting into a pack of enemies, the fight seems to be going well at first, and suddenly it takes a turn, perhaps another elite showed up, enemies poured it in on top of you in the dungeon, and now the fight is looking questionable. Committing to retreat is extremely important in hardcore. If you ever feel like you might end up dying, that's the sign that you need to get out of that fight, reset it, run from the dungeon, or teleport back to town with a scroll of escape. At level 20 on a hardcore character, you can start to find scrolls of escape. They're relatively rare, but not so rare that you need to be overly concerned with saving them. If you're playing on PC, you should keybind that scroll of escape from your emote wheel to one of the keys on your keyboard. I personally have mine bound to F1, which is right above the number 1 and number 2 keys on my keyboard, so I can reach forward, hit F1, and teleport out of the dungeon or wherever I'm at instantaneously back to town and safety. If you're playing on console, unfortunately, to my knowledge right now, there's no way to bind your scroll of escape to a specific key. So what I recommend doing is making sure it's in a good spot on your emote wheel on the very first page, and that you practice going to the emote wheel and selecting the scroll of escape so you can get out of those tight situations, especially when you're probably going to be panicking a little bit. Remember, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Don't panic. Additionally, the Elixir of Death Evasion can be a good tool in hardcore. I personally don't really use this very much. I think it sort of removes a lot of the excitement of hardcore for me. The materials required to craft Elixirs of Death Evasion can be pretty challenging to come by. So rather than have one up at all times, I use them for very specific fights where I know the enemies may have a one-shot mechanic. Times where you could consider using the Death Evasion Elixir would be in the capstone dungeons, or hopefully for any of your attempts against Uber Lilith. Well, that's it for our tips on hardcore in Season 1 of Diablo 4. Make sure to like and subscribe, and please leave a comment down below with any other tips you would like to add, any questions you have for me, any feedback you have for our video, as well as be sure to follow us on Twitch at Boojum35.tv, where we're going to be streaming all of our hardcore playthrough currently, as well as in Season 1. See ya.